before Rivellon, before there were gods to worship or kings to kneel before. There was only existence, vast and quiet, a world without language, without memory. In those earliest moments, the land had no borders. The sky had no stars. Time itself moved slowly, as though unsure it should move at all. This was a world untouched by belief. Nothing was holy. Nothing was forbidden. Nothing was yet afraid. And within that stillness, life began not with fire, but with thought. The beings who would later be called the Eternals did not rise from soil or sea. They awakened, fully formed, from the substance of reality itself. They were shaped by intelligence, by curiosity, by an instinct to endure. They did not age. They did not hunger. They did not die as mortals would later understand death. They simply were. The Eternals walked the silent world and gave it meaning through observation. Where they lingered, stone hardened. Where they gathered, cities grew, not built, but coaxed into being. And at the center of all things flowed a force older than any name it would later be given, a radiant current that bound thought to matter, creation to will. This force would one day be called Source. But in those early ages, it was simply life itself. Source moved through the Eternals like breath through lungs. It obeyed their intention. It answered their desires. It made permanence possible. And for a time, there was harmony. Civilizations of crystal and stone rose beneath the calm sky. Knowledge passed freely between eternal minds. There was no need for conquest, for nothing could truly be taken. But perfection is fragile, and even an immortal world can fracture when it begins to look beyond itself. For beyond the edge of creation, beyond source, beyond thought, something else stirred, a vast, endless absence, a hunger that did not create, but unmade, the void. At first, it was only a pressure, a distant cold, a feeling that something, somewhere, was watching. The Eternals sensed it long before they understood it. And in that moment of unease, the age of innocence quietly ended. The Eternals did not speak of fear. Not at first. They had no word for it, no reason to shape such a sound with their thoughts. In a world without endings, fear had no purpose. Yet the presence, beyond the edge of creation, lingered. It did not strike. It did not announce itself. It waited. And so the Eternals began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly. They studied Source more closely than before. What had once been a natural current, as effortless as breath, became something to be measured, refined, controlled. Source responded as it always had. It brightened at their focus. It flowed more sharply through crystal veins and carved pathways beneath the earth. It allowed cities to grow taller, more intricate, more enduring. But with understanding came division. Some Eternals believed Source should remain free, a shared essence of all that lived and would one day live. Others believed it must be shaped, gathered, protected. If something threatened existence itself, then surely existence had the right to defend itself. Thus began the first act of willful order. The Eternals raised great spires, not merely as dwellings, but as anchors, structures meant to draw Source inward, to pull it, to hold it in place. These were not weapons. Not yet. They were assurances, proof that the world could be stabilized. That chaos, if it came, would find Rivellon ready. But Source is not meant to be still. As it gathered, it grew dense, heavy. It began to bend reality in subtle ways. Time tightened around places of great concentration. Thought echoed longer than intended. Creation lingered after intention had faded, and somewhere beyond the veil of existence, the void noticed. The first incursions were quiet. An Eternal would walk a familiar path and find it missing, not destroyed, not damaged, simply absent. A space where something should have been, now hollow and wrong. Then came the silence. Entire districts where Source dimmed, as though smothered. Eternal minds reaching outward and finding nothing to answer them. Not death, erasure. The Eternals gathered, not in panic, but in urgency. They traced the wounds in reality back to a single truth. The void was not invading. It was responding. Source, drawn together and forced into shape, had become visible beyond creation. A light in the darkness, a signal, and signals invite attention. It was then that the Eternals faced a question they had never needed to ask before. What if we can end? The idea settled uneasily among them. Immortality had never been tested. It had simply been assumed. But now, faced with a force that did not destroy, but unmade, assumption was no longer enough. And so, for the first time since their awakening, the Eternals planned for survival. They sought not merely to preserve their world, but to transcend it. Among them rose 7 figures, thinkers, visionaries, leaders whose understanding of Source surpassed all others. They spoke of a solution, a reshaping of existence. If Source could attract the void, then perhaps Source could also be used to seal it away. But such an act would require sacrifice, more Source than had ever been gathered, more power than any Eternal could wield alone. And quietly, beneath their calm reasoning, another truth took root. If one could command that much Source, one would know realization. The seeds of godhood were sown. They did not call themselves gods. Not at first. The seven who stepped forward spoke with the same calm voices as the others. They walked the same stone halls. They shared the same memories of an endless world. Yet something in them had shifted. Where others studied source as a force of nature, these seven listened to it as though it were a language. They understood its currents, its rhythms, its silences. They understood what it wanted and what it feared. The plan they proposed was simple in its shape and terrible in its consequence. Source, they said, could be gathered one final time, not into towers or anchors, but into living vessels, into themselves. With such power, they could raise a barrier between creation and the void, a veil strong enough to withstand unmaking, a wound in reality, stitched closed from within. The Eternals listened, some in awe, some in quiet horror. To take source in such quantity was not refinement. It was consumption, and consumption implies scarcity. For the first time, source would be taken, not shared. Yet the void did not wait for consensus. More places vanished. More silences spread. The world began to show gaps, like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread. And so, in fear disguised as reason, the Eternals agreed. The ritual was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a long breath drawn before a plunge. The seven stood at the convergence of all gathered source, rivers of light bending inward, spiraling toward their forms. As the power entered them, the world trembled. Stone cracked, sky darkened, and the Eternals felt it then. Not pain, but loss. Source, once infinite, once everywhere, was now less. The seven changed. Their thoughts stretched beyond the present. Their senses reached across continents. Time bent around their awareness. They no longer merely existed. They endured. When the ritual ended, the veil was raised, a shimmering divide between Rivellon and the void. It held. The erasure ceased. The silence retreated. The world was saved, but it was not whole. The seven looked upon the others and understood something terrible. They would not give the source back. To do so would weaken the veil. To weaken the veil would invite the void. And so the Eternals were told a gentler truth. That source was now finite, that it must be rationed, that the world would adapt. What they were not told was that their immortality had been quietly spent. Without the full flow of source, eternal bodies began to change. They tired, they fractured, they began to end. Death, a concept never intended for them, entered the world not as a catastrophe, but as a slow correction. The seven watched this with distant sorrow and distant justification. For gods, once born, must always believe they were necessary. The veil held. For a time, creation breathed again, cautiously, like a patient waking after a long fever. Cities rebuilt where absence had once been. Source, though diminished, still flowed thinner, quieter, but present. And the gods watched. From their elevated stillness, they observed a truth they had not anticipated. The void had not been defeated. It had learned. Where once it pressed blindly against creation, now it lingered, tracing the edges of the veil. Testing, waiting, the gods felt its attention as a constant pressure, not pain, but awareness. An understanding that something vast and patient now knew their names. To strengthen the veil, they required more source, and source, no longer infinite, had to come from somewhere. Thus began the first sin. Not murder, not cruelty, but justification. The gods reasoned that life, once ended, released its source back into the world. That death, properly guided, could become a cycle. That sacrifice could be sustainable. So they shaped the remaining eternals into something new. Mortals, fragile forms bound to time. Lives measured not in ages, but in moments. Bodies that could break, and souls that would return their source upon death. The gods called this balance. The world called it suffering. As mortal civilizations rose, so too did worship. The gods accepted it without protest. Faith, after all, was another current of power softer than source, but no less nourishing. Temples formed. Names were whispered. Stories were told at night, spoken gently, as all fearful truths are. And beneath it all, the void waited. It seeped through in dreams first. Nightmares without images. A sense of falling without movement. Whispers that erased themselves the moment one tried to remember them. Where mortals gathered in great numbers, the veil thinned. Where wars raged, it thinned faster. The gods responded as they always had. With control, they guided conflicts. They elevated champions. They demanded obedience, not out of malice, but out of fear that chaos would tear open reality once more. And still, the void pressed closer. The gods realized then what they had truly done. By reshaping the world to resist unmaking, they had also made it visible. Mortality burned bright. Emotion flared. Every act of love, of grief, of rage sent ripples through the veil. Creation had become loud, and the void, endlessly hungry, could hear everything. The gods did not speak of this to their followers. Instead, they spoke of destiny, of purpose, of a future that required sacrifice. And in doing so, They bound themselves to an endless task, to feed the veil, to delay the inevitable, to remain gods at any cost. Time moves differently in a world that has been shaped by gods, not slowly, not quickly, but persistently, like water carving stone or wind wearing away mountains. The cities of the Eternals and the fledgling mortal civilizations alike shifted. Towers crumbled. Forests grew where roads once lay. Rivers changed their course, unconcerned with memory or mourning. The gods remained distant and attentive. Their vigilance kept the void at bay, but it was not a complete guard. Small gaps appeared, little absences where things once were, whispered losses, tiny cracks in reality that nobody spoke of aloud. And yet life continued. Mortals, unaware of the grand machinations of divine beings, laughed, mourned, loved, and died. Source flowed in and out of them quietly, as intended, sustaining the world in its fragile equilibrium. Legends grew, stories whispered from mouth to ear by candlelight. Names were remembered imperfectly, distorted by time and desire. The gods themselves became part of the myth, faceless benefactors or distant punishers, depending on who told the story. The void, patient beyond comprehension, remained outside the veil. It tested, it watched, but it did not yet strike again. It seemed to wait for the world to forget its vigilance, for those who guard it to falter. And in the quiet moments between life and sleep, when the wind sighs through empty streets, or the sea laps gently at a forgotten shore, the world remembers. It remembers the Eternals, the seven who became gods, the first sin, and the quiet sacrifice of Source. It remembers the hunger at the edges of everything, patient, inexorable, eternal, and somewhere in the depth of silence, beneath all memory and all action, the story continues, not as a tale of endings, but as a gentle reminder that every choice echoes, every power leaves a mark, and every whisper of the past still hums softly beneath the world. Listen closely, and if you drift, drift not from fear, but from the quiet comfort of knowing that Rivellon, fragile as it is, endures. The night stretches long, and the world breathes gently beneath your eyelids.